Hi everyone, this is Joanna Mick with Health Empowerment Center for your book review for this week. And this week I'm going to be talking about The Biology of Belief by Dr. Bruce Lipton. And this was one of the books that really helped me through some trauma healing a few years back. And it was really a great read. It really opened my eyes to a lot of things, and I even got to do with one of my doctoral programs a class that he expounded upon this information in this book. So it was very empowering. I really loved it. It really put the power back in our hands to change and to become who we want to be, and to be able to understand others a little bit more so that we can really forgive. And I think forgive is a very, very powerful tool for us for health and healing, especially in times of trauma. And so it's really understanding how the brain works, how the body works in a relationship to thought, that mind-body connection. I've really, when I went to school to go for natural medicine and Chinese medicine, I never thought that I would be as engrossed into the mind-body connection, being more of a, kind of a, I guess you could say a materialistic type individual, where it's kind of more of a, something you can grasp type science, as opposed to something that's more, I guess you could say, it's not necessarily esoteric, but something that's a little bit more ambiguous, more less tangible is what I'm looking for, actually. Right? So it's understanding, that there's a lot more power within us in the mind that can actually help the body than necessarily the physical aspects of us that we see a lot more because we can touch and handle and see. So in The Biology of Belief, he does get in a bit about epigenetics and how, how we think can cause health issues in the body because of all those, communicating molecules such as our hormones, our neurotransmitters, neuropeptides, etc., that instigate the turning on and off of genes. And so that's why it's called the biology of belief, because it's how our thought processes, how our perceptions, how we've been kind of trained and we've been programmed through our heritage, through our genealogy, through, our parents, our grandparents, our society, etc., that gives us the way we're, that they want us to think. And that thinking actually sets us up for our health or our disease in a lot of cases because of the stress response. Fight or flight, rest and digest, going back and forth between sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. And that is the turning on and off of genes, because the body's trying to survive, and those genes are creating protein molecules, and proteins in the body are either for structure or for function. And so if we have a function going on too long, it's like turning on the sink faucet and leaving it on and forgetting to turn it back off, and then it gets a clog, and then it overflows, and nobody ever turns off the sink or fixes the clog. And that's when a gene is left on too long or not getting turned on at all. You left the plug in the sink and you turned on the water. And then you never turned it off and never unplugged it. So the water's just overflowing in the house, and now you have water damage. And that's kind of a similar thing that can happen within the body when we turn on genes and don't turn off genes, and don't turn on genes that should be turned on, and they're still off. And so in his book, The Biology of Belief, he kind of talks into that programming, and he goes the power of consciousness, because that is where our power lies, is in consciousness. And a lot of times we do a lot of things because the body's about conserving energy, do things the easy way. I mean, we're, that's how we're natured as well. We want to do it the easy way. And so subconscious programs is what tends to run us, about 80 to 90% of the time. And so 10% of the time we're, 10 to 20% of the time, if we're really aware of ourselves, we're actually consciously making choices for our actions and how we're going to respond to our environment, how we're going to respond to our experiences, etc. Whereas the majority of the time, we're just going off of programs. Somebody goes boo and we go, ah, and that's a program. The body's trying to preserve itself. Somebody's, startled us. So then we have that, adrenaline rush, and then we're reacting. And sometimes, depending on what that secondary reaction is too, that's also programmed, is whether or not we're going to take our arm out and swing and hurt somebody, box them, or we run. That's fight or flight, right? Somebody goes, boo, we're either going to punch them or we're going to run away after we do that initial, startled response. And that's automatic. That's the subconscious. And so we have to start becoming consciously aware of how we're making our responses to things so that we can have a better health outcome. Because if we stay in that stressed, high alert state, that leads us to, some conditions, chronic conditions such as hypertension. We can end up with insulin resistance. We can end up with cardiovascular issues, and the list goes on. Chronic pain can even be happening, chronic inflammation from these, heightened states of stress. And so in this book, Dr. Bruce Lipton talks about how we're programmed, because in those first 4 years, and I'm kind of referring back also to the books I talked about from Dr. Joe Dispenza, and how, in those first few years of life, we're kind of in what's called a hypnotic state. We're in a more theta brainwave, where we just soak in information because we're just a sponge, because we don't have any programs per se, other than the genetic programs that are there in our genes. There's stuff already turned on and off based upon our parents' environments and their parents' environments. Up to about 4 generations turns on and off the genes, which gives us the susceptibility to certain, conditions and health outcomes. And then whether or not we keep those genes on or off is how we get programmed kind of in those first 6 years of life, and then how we take over that programming later, which is a little bit harder. It's like getting a computer from the store that's got programs in it. Some you know how to use, some you don't, some you like, some you don't like. And so you got to figure out how to fix that, if you're not. Otherwise, you just kind of get saying, well, I got to just go with what my computer's got. And that's what a lot of us do, because we don't understand how do we reprogram our mind. And that's what this book is kind of about, along with the books I talked about a couple weeks ago from Dr. Joe Dispenza. So, that's what we have to see. So he kind of gets into it more in layman's terms of how, our parents, we watch our parents, we're in that sponge state, and we take in how they respond to the environment, and that's how we become, subconsciously programmed, because it goes into our subconscious mind. When you're in that theta state, that delta theta state, where you kind of just take in the information and it just goes past the frontal cortex, which is our thinking mind, straight in to our subconscious mind, it programs it automatically, because we're about survival. And so that's how we've kind of evolved and adapted, is to take in this information so that we can survive, because our parents are still here, our grandparents are still here, individuals are still here, and they're surviving. So it must have been, we kind of just take it for, granted that that's the best way to survive, because they're still here. So they do it, so it must work. It works per se, but maybe not optimally. And that's where, when we get later in life, and now we have to start saying, And so a lot of times this is where he speaks about, where sometimes they say it's genetic predisposition for hypertension, for, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, etc., a lot of these chronic illnesses. And he says, well, yes and no. You have a predisposition to it, not necessarily directly from the genes, but the epigenetic side of the gene. So the genes are there, and it's all about turning them on and off. And what happens is you're doing the same things that your parents or grandparents did, that turns on and off of those same genes, and therefore you're creating the environment in the body for those same conditions. So it looks familial, like it would be genetic, but it's really about turning them on and off. And so we have more power over the gene of, that predisposition to actually go away from it, from understanding that, hey, we may have to change how we were responding to these events and these, experiences from our parents and our grandparents, so that we don't perpetuate these illnesses in our own lives. And so he gets into saying, even in himself, he was talking about in one of his experiences, he wanted to have, a happy family life. And because unfortunately in his family, his father didn't create a happy family, and so his family, his parents ended up divorcing, and so he got married, believing that he could have a happy family. Unbeknownst to him, though, when he got past what he called the honeymoon phase, where you're kind of, you're excited and it's all new. So you're in that frontal cortex, he says. So you're in the conscious mind. So you're making conscious choices, conscious actions towards that happy marriage you want. But then eventually life begins to happen. Things become mundane. Things become, kind of a ritualistic or, commonplace, and then we fall into those pre-programmed actions, the subconscious actions. And he said, he started hearing, oh, you're acting like your father. And he didn't like that. And he's like, I'm not acting like my father. Only to later find that because he didn't become aware that he was acting like his father, his marriage ended up falling apart. And he had to actually come to reality to start really looking at his actions and seeing he was doing the exact same things his father did, which programmed him subconsciously, and therefore he was unable to have that happy marriage because he was perpetuating his father's actions subconsciously. And so he was saying, if you want to have something that you didn't have before, you're going to have to take a look and see, why is that happening? Are you going to be giving different responses than your predecessors? And you're going to have to do it cognizantly. You're going to have to be aware of it. You're going to have to be conscious of it. And it's difficult sometimes because we get so much into the rat race of stress, and that really throws us back into that subconscious mind and away from that forefront, that forebrain here that gets us thinking. And so it's the power of consciousness. Again, it's making yourself aware of what you're doing on a daily basis. So you're going to have to get away from that 80 to 90% subconscious into the conscious mind. And so utilizing tools such as journaling, meditation, visualization, things like that brings you into awareness. Taking time to reflect at the end of the day. What did I do today? How was I responding to my environment? Did I do things unawareingly? And then also listening to others' feedbacks. If you're hearing things like, you're acting like your mother, you're acting like your father, you're acting like so-and-so, or, whatever it may be, or you hurt my feelings, or and you weren't aware, taking a moment and reflecting on it rather than doing a rebuttal. To say, okay, because that's somebody else's view that they're seeing, and it's sometimes you're blind to it, because when you do things subconsciously, he talks about, when you're driving down the road and you're driving and all of a sudden 10 minutes later you're like, how did I get here? Did I even see? I hope I didn't run anybody off the road, because you did the driving subconsciously because you've done it so many times. Again, the body and the mind is all about making things easier. And so you do driving for so often, especially if you're driving the same route over and over again. So they do recommend you drive different routes to work, so it keeps you more in the conscious mind and working the brain, because that when you fall in that subconscious, that's where things get a little hairy, right? And so, that's how we go through life a lot of times. Every day we get up, we go to work, we do the same routines over and over again, that we actually spend the day and we're not even aware of what we've done the whole day long. Just like driving down the road and all of a sudden you realize, where am I at? Where have I been for the last 20 miles, of driving? Your thoughts are in the future, or they're in the past, or think about this or that, but they're not on the driving. And that's a lot of times how we go through our days. We're thinking about tomorrow, we think about yesterday, and not paying attention to today, and then we miss everybody that's around us, such as our kids or our spouse, etc. They're like, you don't even see me. They used to get up, hi hun, give them a kiss, go make breakfast, send them out the door, da 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 da, but you're not really aware of them. And how you're interacting with them. You're subconsciously just responding. And a lot of times it's in the same avenue that you were responded to by your parents, your grandparents, or how society, or however you were kind of brought up or nurtured in those first 6 years of your life. And, and if you didn't like it when you were that age, do you think that your family is appreciating it as well? And if it was something that you were okay with that, then that maybe it is. But if they're coming back at you and saying, hey, what about me? What about this? It's taking a moment and reflecting on it, because you may be doing things subconsciously and not in full conscious awareness. And that's where we have the ability to change, the ability to change our environment, change our predisposition of our genetics for health and wellness, is when we become consciously aware of how we're making our choices through the day, how we're choosing to interact with our environment, responding to, work, home, family, friends, strangers, and the list goes on. And so it depends, you have to kind of take awareness and, sitting down with yourself and saying, what is it that I would like to be? Because you can be anything, as we talked about with evolve your brain, breaking the habit of being yourself. Those books by Dr. Dispenza, is realizing you can be whoever you want to be and not be confined to who you are today. And it's by becoming consciously aware of how you've been programmed and what part of those programs. So basically rebuilding your computer. If you want a supercomputer and you don't like the programs that are on there and you want something that does better, you got to reprogram that computer to do what you want it to do. And so the same for yourself, you have to reprogram it, and you have to do it consciously and awaringly. And so that means it takes a little bit of brain power to do it for real. And so, first kind of having a map, or having a, making yourself a plan of action. What is it that I want to be, or a description of who you want to be, right? Who is it that I would like to be? What kind of family environment do I want? What kind of job do I want? And list it out as detailed as you can get it, because that's going to be your map to how you're going to start changing how you're interacting with your environment, how you're thinking about your day. What are the things you're going to start doing? How are you going to change up what you're doing? Because to become somebody new, you can't keep doing what you were, right? Because 1 + 1 is always 2. So you're going to have to change part of that equation to get to 3. So 1 + 2 is 3. It's a very simple thinking, but that's how we have to realize, Einstein said, doing the same thing over again and over again, expecting a different result, is insanity. And so we have to be aware of it. And a lot of times, again, we're trying to get a different result, but we're not making new programs. We're using our same program that's back there subconsciously because we're not aware of it. And so it's very important to be aware. So for myself, after I read this book, it really helped me to take a step back from the people that caused me trauma or caused me hurt over the years, to really start looking at some of the instances of the pain that was caused to me by these individuals and seeing, oh, I see, they weren't there. They were driving down the road. And I just happened to be a casualty on that road because they weren't cognizantly aware of how they were interacting with me. And I could see where it was coming from their past. And it really helped me to I could forgive them and say, they didn't have an awareness, per se, in what they were doing. And, not to say that they don't need to take responsibility and maybe, say they're sorry. But for myself, it was because then I had to take my own actions and realizing I don't want to perpetuate that same type of interaction where I could extend that, hurt to somebody else that I encounter from that same type of programming. And so it really helped me to understand and to forgive and to be able to even reflect on myself in doing those same types of things where you just lash out because you're mad at somebody else. You hear about that displacement of anger a lot of times is done in a subconscious way because their mind is over there still dealing with that person or that thing that really upset them, and you're just coming into it. They don't see you, they see that, and they lash with whatever that anger is, and that's that kind of displacement that goes on there. And so we, when we can start seeing that and maybe being aware of it, so we can kind of say, hey, whoa, you need to take a moment, take a chill, because I'm not what you're seeing in your mind. I'm somebody different. I'm not coming here to battle with you or anything. I'm just saying hi or whatever it might be, So that's something that really helped me in this reading this book and helping through some of those traumas is understanding the other individuals and where they're coming from and the programmings that they may have to be dealing with, and unfortunately how it's perpetuated through others. And then being able to see it in myself and to start making the changes for myself, and to realizing I've got to stop some of those subconscious programmings that's not helping me meet my goals and where I want to be in my life. So if you get a chance and you want to learn more about how you can have a better life by becoming more consciously aware, having better health because you're changing your thinking, changing your biology by changing your belief systems, is checking out this book by Dr. Bruce Lipton called The Biology Belief. And like I said, it was very empowering to me because it shows you how much power you have in your thought when you become consciously aware that you have a power of choice, you have a power of consciousness, you can change who you are. You don't have to stay with the likelihood of any type of health issues if you take action. So, Biology of Belief, Dr. Bruce Lipton. This is Joanna with Health Empowerment Center. See you next time.